Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Tara Brewster. Thank you all for being here today. Just a few housekeeping points before we begin. I wanted to let you all know that we have enabled closed captioning as a part of this programming. So on a laptop at the bottom of the screen, there should be an icon for closed captioning, live transcript. And on a tablet, there is enable live transcript icon at the bottom that you should see as well. So hopefully, if you need some help hearing, as most of us do at this point in our lives, you can go and find some closed captioning and get a little bit more help in that way. And also, if you want to watch in speaker view, it's just a little bit more vibrant and focused rather than seeing a bunch of people on your screen, although that's fun too. So no pressure, you choose you today. So thank you so much and welcome. We're so happy to be here once again, celebrating the founding of the Northampton Association for Education and Industry on April 8th of 1842. Hopefully, some of you had the good fortune to join Steve Strymer's walking tour this morning in Florence to hear the stories and view key sites important to the radical abolitionist utopian community that was based on the principles of racial, economic, and gender equality. When Steve gives a tour, it becomes abundantly clear how special a place Florence was then and is now. The David Ruggles Center for History and Education was created in April of 2008 to commemorate this important history. There have been many dedicated committee members of the DRC since that time, but the current roster is as follows: Lisa Baskin, Tom Goldscheider, Suzanne Love, Marie Panic, Sarah Lennox, Steve Strymer, Kim Gerould, Kevin McQuillan, Ousmane Power-Greene, Emma Khan Sudan, Stephanie Pasternak, and Chris Thompson, and myself, Tara Brewster. I just wanted to say thank you to everyone for your volunteer efforts on our behalf. It's much appreciated. Florence's abolitionist history must continue to be held up to the light and preserved so that others may know the full power of the equality and what famed abolitionists like Sojourner Truth and David Ruggles found so compelling here. We would like to begin this symposium by acknowledging that this region, called Western Massachusetts, was founded and built on the unceded homelands of the Potomac Nation and the land of the Norituck community. We begin with gratitude for nearby waters and lands. We recognize these lands and waters as important relations with which we are all interconnected and depend on to sustain life and well-being. The Pocumtuck had connections with these lands for millennia. Over 400 years of colonization, when Potomac peoples were displaced, many joined their Algonquian relatives to the east, south, west, and north. That includes the Mashpee and the Aquina Wampanoag, Nipmuc, Narragansett, Mohican, Pequot, Mohican communities, and the Abenaki and other nations of the Wabanaki Confederacy. These Native peoples still maintain connections and relationships of care for these lands today. As an active first step towards decolonization, we encourage you to learn more about Native nations and indigenous homelands on which you live and work. We also invite you to deepen your relationship to these living lands and waters. Through the relationship with past and present, we can become more conscious and intelligent future peoples. On to the program. I'm very excited to introduce Tom Goldscheider. He's a member of the David Ruggles Committee, as I already mentioned. Tom is a public historian based in Western Massachusetts. He holds a master's in history from the University of Massachusetts at Amherst, with a concentration in US history. His research is focused on local history. He has published 2 articles in the Historical Journal of Massachusetts, Shays' Rebellion, Reclaiming the Revolution in 2015, and At Swords Point, the United Electrical Workers Union, and the Greenfield Tap and Die Company in 2019. He has given talks at area venues based on both articles. He is the education coordinator for the David Ruggles Center for History and Education in Florence, Mass. He was awarded a grant in 2019 to create a new curriculum for visiting students at the center. Tom, take it away.
Thank you, Tara, and thank you all for being here. Our museum interprets the history of the Northampton Association of Education and Industry, a utopian community founded on the principle of what they called radical equality. This was a member-run and member-owned organization based on one person, one vote, regardless of race, gender, religious affiliation, or social standing. It grew into what they termed a concentration of light in the national cause to abolish slavery in the United States. A small group of founding families pooled their resources and purchased a state-of-the-art silk mill on 300 acres of land in the sparsely settled section of Northampton we now call Florence. They gathered on April 8th, 1842, to ratify their own constitution, a document that guided and governed the Northampton Association over the next 4.5 years of its existence. The David Ruggles Center was officially launched on April 8th, 2008, to honor the creation of the intentional community that attracted the likes of Sojourner Truth and David Ruggles to become members. We host this annual symposium in April in recognition of what took place here 180 years ago. Today is also an opportunity to open our most active season with a brief, I promise, recounting of recent activities. Let me begin by reminding you of what we have not been doing since we met last April. We have not been hosting in-person events, opening our museum to visitors, or hosting large visiting school groups. We have had to adapt to existing circumstances like everyone else, and adapt we did. We took our history out of doors in the form of educational walking tours around the village. We partnered with Friends of Northampton Trails to lead our first ever bike tour, with more to come. We also partnered with Grow Food Northampton to offer educational workshops at the Florence Community Garden, where we grow historically themed crops. We recently partnered with the Bombeck Center for Arts and Equity on a series of upcoming events honoring Juneteenth. New and old supporters have stepped forward to help us through this challenging time. Thanks to the efforts of State Senator Joe Comerford, we got state funding used to pay off our mortgage and make necessary repairs to 225 Nonotuck Street. Area contractors replaced our chimney and electrical panel free of charge or by special contribution. We got funding from Mass Humanities to create a gallery space on our website and to write an interactive curriculum for visiting middle and high school students. Lastly, we got a major grant from the Northampton Community Preservation Act Committee to hire 2 leading historians to help us prepare an application to the National Register of Historic Places to designate large parts of the village as the Florence Abolition and Reform National Historic District. The application itself is a valuable historical resource that compiles and interprets years of rigorous research. When approved, this designation will make sure this chapter of Florence history, including what you will be hearing about today, is never again forgotten. The history we interpret at the Ruggles Center is sadly more relevant than ever. W.E.B. Du Bois famously wrote in 1903 that the problem of the 20th century is the problem of the color line. Tragically, that problem is with us still. Radicalized slavery was and forever will, racialized slavery was and forever will be the elephant in the room in understanding American history. Even in 2022, persons of African descent living in North America were enslaved for longer than they were free. The form of slavery imposed here on men, women, and children was among the cruelest in world history. The legacy of this colossal injustice and all that followed emancipation lives with us today. What can we do as historians? We do our level best to get the story right and to make it understandable to non-historians. History matters. Sitting here in Massachusetts, I see three main strands to this history. The first is the movement to abolish slavery. This is the story we tell at the Ruggles Center. This was a foundational and integrated social movement with many lessons for us today. The second strand is New England's complicity in the profits of slavery. Great fortunes were built on human suffering, oftentimes kept out of view. I direct your attention to the work of the Atlantic Black Box Project on this subject. The third strand directs our attention to the lives of African Americans who lived in our communities, both as enslaved and as free persons. We want to hear from the people who lived this history. The Ruggles Center was invited to participate in a sweeping project entitled Documenting the Early History of Black Lives in the Connecticut River Valley. We contributed research to their website, and today's talks are based on two essays that appear there. A third essay entitled How We Found Their Houses was the subject of this morning's walking tour. We don't think of slavery in Massachusetts when in fact, this was the first colony to write it into law. We don't think of African Americans living in cities and towns across Western Massachusetts when in fact, robust communities took hold across the region, including here in Florence. We have to dig for this history, largely because the majority of this population fled the state following the passage of the Fugitive Slave Law in 1850. We are rendering the invisible visible and offering tips to people motivated to investigate their own town's deep history. There's an enormous complexity to the varied stories of African Americans living across 4 counties over 4 centuries. When assembled, we can glimpse larger truths and take measure of what was added and what was lost to our regional history. Kim Gerould, a recently retired educator at Northampton's Jackson Street School, is one of our new volunteers. Working on the Documenting Black Lives project was her introduction to the Ruggles Center. She contributed an essay to the project on the life and work of David Ruggles. Her focus today is on his activist work during the years he lived in Northampton. We call David Ruggles the most important figure in the movement to abolish slavery that you have never heard of. Our mission is to fix that. Ousmane Power-Greene is a widely published author and professor of history at Clark University. Today, he will tell us about his experiences of doing research in this area with a focus on obstacles, pitfalls, and rewards he encountered in discovering and recreating the lives of Black women who lived here. Please make note of questions or comments you have and type them into the chat or save them for our question and answer period following Ousmane's talk. With any luck, I will be able to meet some of you in person next year or hopefully sooner. In the meantime, be sure to check our website for upcoming events, and please welcome Kim Gerould on David Ruggles, Making Good Trouble in Northampton.
Thank you so much. And thank you to everybody who came out today. I just want to give you a sketch of David Ruggles. I can't tell you about his whole life. Am I on? Can you hear me okay? Yeah. Focusing on his time here in Northampton. But I just want to say a little bit about how I came to this. As a teacher, I always wanted my students to know the histories and the stories that I was never taught of Native peoples. I really appreciated your comments, Tara, at the beginning, of African Americans, of activists. And when I retired, it just made sense for me to join this group of people. I was familiar with Sojourner Truth, Frederick Douglass, but I knew pretty much nothing about David Ruggles. So I started with this amazing biography of his, which I'll type it into the chat, of Graham Hodges. It's the only biography, and it's an excellent biography. And then, as Tom mentioned, I participated in the Documenting Early Black Lives project and got to dig into the archives of the Ruggles Center, and found out a lot about David Ruggles. So he was 32 when he got here to Northampton in the fall of 1842. So it was only like a half year after the association was founded. Just to give you a little background, he was born in Norwich, Connecticut, of a free Black family. And in his teen years, after a stint as a mariner, he made his way to New York City. He ended up making good trouble, and a lot of it, as a leading Black abolitionist and an activist on the Underground Railroad in New York City for well over a decade. He ran a bookstore, he wrote and published articles, he published his own magazine called The Mirror of Liberty, and he founded the New York Committee of Vigilance. He was committed to direct action, confrontation, defending fugitives and free Blacks from kidnapping, and he helped at least 600 people to freedom, including Frederick Douglass and our own Basil Dorsey, whose Underground Railroad marker you can actually see in the Park Street Cemetery. But Ruggles paid a high price for his activism, having suffered physical attacks, even jail time. And by the time he arrived here, he was sick. He was practically blind. He had severe health issues. He found a warm welcome and respect from the members of the association. He'd been referred to the association by David Child. And here he focused on his recovery and started to explore hydropathy, or the water cure, which was growing in popularity at the time. And this is what he wrote about the association to the Albany Northern Star. He said, quote, "Being here, sheltered by friendship, in this promising home for humanity, until health and sight shall allow me to re-enter the field of reform, for the regeneration of the race, for the redemption of humanity." But early on, despite his health issues, we see him continuing his anti-slavery work, writing letters to abolitionist newspapers like The Liberator, the National Anti-Slavery Standard, and others. And he was a friend and mentor to other African Americans in this community, including Sojourner Truth, who arrived about a year after he did, and also joined the association, as Tom mentioned. Now, less than a year later, on August 1st, 1843, the National Anti-Slavery Standard reported on a meeting in Northampton commemorating the end of slavery in the British Empire exactly 10 years earlier. It was kind of a predecessor to our Juneteenth. And David Ruggles presided over this celebration and, quote, made a pertinent address explanatory of the occasion when the manacles and chains fell instantaneously from the limbs of 800,000 men and women. Now, by 1844, we can really see Ruggles, the organizer, at work. At this time, about 10% of what is now called Florence was African American, a significant number for a small New England town. Some had come here via the Underground Railroad and stayed. Others were free Blacks who had settled here. And most likely, the association, with its abolitionist politics and commitment to equality, along with the presence of Ruggles, made this a more welcoming community to them. Ruggles called together the first ever rally of Northampton's Black citizens. This is 1844, along with a committee of 7 other local African Americans, to publicize the plight of some white abolitionists who'd been imprisoned for aiding fugitives in the South. And the ad for the rally says, I love this language that you find in the newspapers in the 1840s. Citizens of Northampton and vicinity are hereby notified of a mass meeting to consider the case of Reverend Charles Torrey and Captain Jonathan Walker, citizens of Massachusetts who are captured at the South and threatened to be sacrificed upon the altar of slavery. Come and contribute sympathy and money to their relief. Now, also of significance in this meeting, Sojourner Truth, who'd already been preaching religiously, gave her first anti-slavery, or at least the first one we know about, her first anti-slavery speech about the practical workings of slavery in the North. And Ruggles most likely encouraged and supported her in this, as she embarked on her own speaking career and began to incorporate these themes of abolition and women's rights. In the following year, Ruggles becomes embroiled in a case of an enslaved woman from Georgia, Catherine Linda was her name, whose enslavers had brought her to Northampton during a visit. And he'd been involved in similar cases in New York City. At the time, Northampton was a popular summer destination for Southern planters. And Ruggles, together with association member Erasmus Darwin Hudson, that's a mouthful, they'd heard from an African-American acquaintance of hers that she wanted her freedom. So they got a hearing with a local judge who told her that, yes, in fact, under Massachusetts law, she could be free. But knowing that her children were still under the control of her enslavers, she did return with them to Georgia. And Hudson was thrown in jail for his efforts in this case, even though Ruggles testified to support him. I just want to take a moment here to remind us of the times, and Tom also really made a great reference to this. You know, there were still 3 million slaves. There were 3 million enslaved people in the US. And Massachusetts had abolished slavery in the 1780s, but New York State's gradual emancipation only began in 1827. Racism was rampant in the North, and Blacks, both formerly enslaved and free, were in danger of being kidnapped back to the South. And as Tom said, the economy, the Northeast growing industrial economy, was of course based on slave labor. So these were really dark times, and I think that we have much to learn from these stories of resistance of people like Ruggles and Sojourner and so many others as we navigate our own very dark times. So Ruggles continued to work the abolition circuit. He chaired a major anti-slavery convention in New Bedford, Massachusetts, where he reported a fond reunion with Frederick Douglass. And when Douglass started his own paper, the North Star, Ruggles eagerly signed on as an agent to publicize and sell the paper. Eventually, Ruggles joined the Free Soil Party in 1848, which had wide support among Black and white abolitionists. But tragically, in 1849, while Ruggles was running his own water cure facility here on the banks of the Mill River, he succumbed to illness and he died at the age of 39. Less than a year later, the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 was passed, and 10 local African Americans called together a protest meeting in downtown Northampton. And had he lived, I'm sure Ruggles would have been among them, but I'm sure they held him in their hearts and minds as their friend and mentor. And we can also count on him as one of our own examples of unwavering dedication to the cause of freedom. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Kim. That was wonderful. Thank you, Tom. So I just wanted to also mention that Kim is a co-founder of the local grassroots organization, Families with Power, and has been an activist ever since marching against the Vietnam War in DC. And as a newcomer of the David Ruggles Center, she is thrilled to be learning the history of our community and sharing it in tours. I'm so happy to have her giving tours. It's one more robust DRC member to be able to guide people around Florence Center. So thank you so much for that, Kim. And thank you for placemaking, just history and the struggles comparing to now and the struggles we're having. It was really resonated for me. So thank you so much. I also wanted to say, to echo Tom, that comments, please hold your comments until the end, when we will open it up to questions of any sort, whether from Tom's talk or Kim's talk or Ousmane's talk. And also would be remiss to not direct you to the David Ruggles Center website, davidrugglescenter.org, where you can learn more about what we do and what we've been up to, and also be able to donate there very easily online. So last but not least, Ousmane, Power-Greene. I don't know, I'm very impressed always with you and all that you've done and all that you do for our community and beyond. There's a really great bio of you on the symposium website under the davidrugglescenter.org event. And I won't read verbatim here because there's a lot, but needless to say, you are an associate professor in the history department and director of Africana Studies at Clark University in Worcester. And when I asked Ousmane to send me his bio that he would like me to read, he sent me like a 10-page CV, which was really impressive. And I just wanted to kind of highlight it for you, and you can ask him questions from this highlight if you want at the end, no pressure. But 5 different levels of education you've completed, Ousmane, 6 different employers, 5 different honors and awards, most recently the National Endowment for Humanities Scholars in Residence Fellow, amazing work, 5 published books, 5 articles, 4 book chapters, 4 reviews, 7 podcasts, radio and television, notable attributes, papers presented, roundtables and lectures, over 40 of them. I thought I did a lot. You do a lot. I'm very impressed with this resume, Ousmane. Clark University service. He has served on over 14 committees, chaired different series and concentrations. He's a board member of Self-Evident Media, in addition to being on the David Ruggles Center committee. We all love Michael Lawrence Riddell. And service and events beyond campus, over 7 of them, courses taught at Clark, over 10. And so professional affiliation 6, I could go on, but I won't. Needless to say, you're very accomplished, and we're all very honored to have you here, Ousmane. Thank you for being a part of this symposium for us.
Thank you, Tara. Actually, I am a person who many people on here have met many times, so I see myself in among a group of people who I know fairly well. But for those who don't, been volunteering with the Ruggles Center, I believe, for about 6 years or so, and I was very honored to be asked to present some of my work to all of you who on Founders Day. I recall being up at the Elks spot at a previous Founders Day event. I don't even remember how many years ago that was now. We had a chance to talk about, all the research that has been going on locally, and will continue to go on. I chose to talk to everyone today about just certain, both reflections and thoughts about doing research in the archive, particularly the challenges that research and scholars face writing about Black women. And I decided that this would be an appropriate topic. I was asked last year to participate in the Juneteenth event that the Pioneer Valley History Network put on. And after that, it really got me thinking and reflecting on, how we really do this work, how we really sit down and attempt to capture the lives of people who for a variety of reasons, just have not and continue not to really get that much attention. And so my paper is, was sort of like the draft of the, more polished essay that is on the website for documenting Black lives. And so I want to sort of read some of this to you, talk to you about this idea, the greater challenges that we face doing research on Black women in the Connecticut River Valley, but also use as an opportunity to talk about what I see to be tremendous promises, right, in terms of the moment we're in, digital revolution, and a lot of things that have been happening in terms of research in at least the last 10 years, but definitely the last 6 years in terms of crowdsourcing and also global interest around African American history. So so actually, one more thing I'll say before I just sort of read part of this to you is that I want to talk about knowledge construction. This is something I was uncertain as I thought about speaking to all you about this topic of knowledge construction, archives, because at first I was like, this is gonna be so boring, it's gonna be dreadful. But then I was talking to my wife and I said, and I told her what I planned on talking about, and she said, no, she thought it was really interesting. So, so I'm gonna proceed despite my fear that there's only a handful of people who are really, really interested in sort of how we think about constructing knowledge. So with the emergence of Black Lives Matter movement, scholars and teachers and archivists have turned their attention to their own fields, to lift African-American voices. And this is, of course, across the entire, plane of professions. I'm asked to give talks to all different groups of people. And scholars, as well as civic organizations, are really just doing what organizations like the National Association of Colored Women's Clubs has actually been doing for over 100 years. That is, these Black club women have been gathering together, small snippets and putting together readers for people that included, sort of biographies of prominent Black women. And so in some ways, the new enthusiasm among people is a part of a much larger trend of non-academic historians doing incredible and crucial historical work, right? And I say non-academic historians for a reason, right? Because we oftentimes just think of academic historians as the ones that are doing sort of quote unquote serious historical work, and that's never been true, but particularly in terms of African-American history. So my paper attempts to offer sort of a Black historian's perspective about the challenge and rewards of researching about Black women in archives. And I want to talk about both the actual literal sort of efforts to construct knowledge, but also what I think to be as metaphysical challenges we face, particularly as Black people doing research in very small, predominantly white towns, particularly Black women, particularly graduate students, for example, who are in their sort of early phases of constructing knowledge, and how the sort of metaphysical elements of this experience, and one of the reasons why it's so challenging. The issues and concerns around doing research certainly overlap with this idea of what we choose to research and write about, how we choose to construct knowledge, and then how people receive those efforts at constructing knowledge. Now, while such work in terms of research and writing about Black women might feel overwhelming to some, there has been a serious breakthrough over the last 10 years, a little longer too, but particularly the last few years, with demonstrating the possibilities of doing research about Black women. And the one I really want to focus on is Erica Armstrong Dunbar's book about On a Judge, Never Caught. Now, I'm just going to sort of pause for a second and try to help us understand what's the significance of this work. So there's a variety of ways that's important. The most important for our sake, for this conversation, has to be, or is this sort of idea of using scant archival materials in order to sketch out a much, much larger biographical picture, and then make an argument about the significance of this figure to how we think about George Washington, right? So what I'm arguing and trying to help us understand is that the reward for doing this sort of research is it actually has led to a rethinking of one of the central figures in American history, right? Doing research on Black women, wandering through the scant archives in New England, trying to see what Professor Armstrong Dunbar could find, the ways in which that helps make a case to help an entire field of American history rethink George Washington, right? And how we sort of think about his role in regards to owning slaves. And so you really see that. I mean, the book came out in 2017, and looking at, I've gone online and looked at even just sort of like Mount Vernon and research being done there, and the historical narratives around Washington, and just the way in which that sort of changed those narratives and really engaged it. And so because of this idea of, quote unquote, reading against the sources which she employs, in other words, when she finds information about Washington's family, analyzing it, not necessarily from the vantage point of sort of like what Martha Washington and George Washington meant, but saying like, okay, with what they said, how does that help us understand the significance of Ona Judge in their lives, right? So, we're reading these, even the archives, the more prominent people, with an effort to sort of read against it, and then think to ourselves, okay, how does this help sketch out aspects of the picture that is missing in the archive, right? Now, there are those, and there are those who sort of challenge the sort of value of using a methodology like this, because traditional historical writing, I guess in the sort of like most traditional sort of way, would include going to, say, a place like Historic Northampton maybe, but place that I spent time at is the American Antiquarian Society, and going through literally a box, and in that box attempting to find whatever you can, whatever bits of information about your subject, in order to sketch out for the rest of the world, information, maybe an article or a book about the figures. That's like the most traditional sort of methodology. Now, some question this methodology of attempting to use a very, very small scraps, maybe a narrative, which was published for Ona Judge in a maybe abolitionist newspaper, and then attempting to reconstruct their lives, the subjects' lives, through whatever they can find, but really most of which is going to be outside of what we think about as traditional sort of manuscripts. Sometimes it's going to be court documents, these sorts of things, in order to do the best one can, attempting to understand the figure's life. Now, there's something larger, though, that I think is at play, and why the work by Erica Armstrong Dunbar is so important, and that is the very question about who we should write about or study in the first place. May take it for granted, this crowd may take this for granted, right? But we have to remember that, for a long time, though particularly Black women who are being researched and written about are sort of outside of scholarly research, right? So scholars and who are writing and then sort of creating knowledge that's going to go into, potentially, books, and then potentially going to influence teachers and maybe textbooks and things. That realm, that type of sort of historical writing was valued, and attempting to write about Black women, particularly someone like Ona Judge, was seen as like, what's the purpose of that? Like, what's the value in trying to reconstruct the lives of Black women who are not prominent? Now, Ona Judge, in relation to George Washington, in some people's mind, people would say, oh, okay, that's fine. She's somewhat maybe as important for that reason. Maybe someone makes that claim. But if I were to say, some of the subjects that I try to reconstruct their lives in terms of women who find themselves involved in the colonization movement, there are scholars sort of who really don't see like, what finding a scrap of information about a person, how that is going to be of a tremendous value to your larger project, right? So my point is that what you're up against when you're sort of doing this type of work is not just the sort of idea of finding sources and like finding any bits of information. It's the question of, when you find scraps, what value do they ultimately have to helping us understand whatever it is the history that we're attempting to understand. And so this sort of gets at what I mentioned as a sort of larger metaphysical question about what we value, right? What we seek to construct in the first place, and how that ends up shaping the narratives that go on and end up shaping a given place, right? Place, a town, a marker, a statue, all of these things, right? Now, despite the sort of acceptance of social history, right, also women's history, African-American history within the historical profession, still the privileging of sort of archival materials continue to sort of keep those we think about as traditional white male figures, organizations continue to be at the forefront, right? So not saying that women's studies movement, Black studies movement has not sort of offset and changed how we think about this. But at the end of the day, the sort of what is valued in terms of your own historical practice continues to be driven by this sort of type of archival sources that are only predominantly, in terms of 19th century, men of property and standing, right? So people could say, oh yeah, I really value the work you do, Professor Power-Greene, or I value the sort of, the efforts that you do. But at the end of the day, the way the sort of profession is structured, it's still a sort of large undertaking to even begin to try to produce work, publish work, get awards, receive awards, and sort of fit within the sort of professional historical ecology when you're working with so many small sources, right? And this is what I see to be the sort of prevailing issue that we face if we're ever going to move beyond and really try to construct narratives about Black women in New England, right? As opposed to, say, the South or other sorts of regions, right? There is this sense among people, graduate students, scholars, younger scholars, particularly because of tenure, right? To sort of lean away from works that they don't have a ton of archival materials available to them, and instead to try to fasten on to organizations or people that have many more materials that are available to them, right? So even if there's on this side a push among people to want to know more stories of Black women in New England, in Massachusetts, in Northampton, right? Historical profession is still, values the idea of producing a work that is heavily dependent on archival sources. And so if you, despite your interest in writing and research about this over here, in terms of your professional career, you're dissuaded from really pursuing some of these individuals, or just any, sorts of thinking about Black women, because at the end of the day, you're sort of worried and concerned that professional historians will sort of look at your work and look at the back of the book and say, I'm looking at this great book right here by Douglas Edgerton, and look and say, oh, well, there's no archival sources in here. They're just print sources, and therefore devalue your work, right? And so this is the reason why I bring up this sort of question and say that this is something that is beyond merely finding materials. You're also coming up against an entire profession and an entire way of approaching historical research and writing that really dissuade this type of work. And you really see this, when you look at PhD students, right? You look at, so if we were to do a survey of PhD programs and people who are doing work on African-American women, I bet you, and again, I've never done this, so actually, it'll be interesting for some of you have some time on your hands to do this, but when you look at dissertations done and you look at, say, Black women in the Black Panthers, for example, right? Or Black women in more contemporary topics, that's gonna be a lot higher, right? Because some of those women, their materials are in archives, right? And so at the end of the day, if I'm a scholar and I want to write about, Erica Huggins, for example, or Elaine Brown, right? And I know I'm dealing with the sort of historical profession, as long as I sort of can go to, University of California, Berkeley's archives and look in her papers, I know that's going to be valued more. And so instead of doing a topic about, say, Black women in Massachusetts and Western Mass or something like that, or, abolition or something, I may decide to do my dissertation topic on that because of the fact that I know that it's going to be valued more than if I do a dissertation that has very scant archival primary sources, right? So this is what I mean when I say that the effort to reconstruct Black women's lives in early America in 19th century, in the sort of era that the Ruggles Center, so we think about David Ruggles' time in the 1840s, that's sort of what we're facing more so than I think anything else. And the one other example I can give to sort of really illustrate that has to do with studying Black communism, right? So I teach a class on Black communists and social seminar right now, right? So right away, some of you are thinking to yourselves, wow, that sounds like a really hard topic to do research about. But it's not as hard because NYU Tamanet Library has a very large oral history collection, right, of Black women communists, right? When I say large, like, I mean large, like relative to the sort of stuff we're working with. And so therefore, if I were to do a study on, you know, say Vicky Garvin or some Black woman communist in the mid-century, I could go to an archive, NYU Tamanet Library. I could sit with manuscript collections and read these oral histories and read stuff that's been gathered together. And when I produce a book and I come up for 10-year awards, people will say, oh, wow, there's so many archival sources. Like, you know, wow, I never thought that. And it ends up being privileged more than, let's say, if you took up the lives of Black women in the Connecticut Valley, for example, and you sort of know that you're not going to have that many actual, you know, manuscript collections, archives that you went into in order to produce your work, right? So in other words, your work could actually take more time. It could be more sort of painstaking in the most, like, you know, specific. I mean, literally driving around these tiny historical societies that have a manuscript here. You know, talking to, as I have, and those who are on here who know me, if I meet a genealogist or archivist, or I'm, you know, hey, you know, just like, hey, always curious what's there just to find. It's way more work. It's much more time consuming. And at the end of the day, the results you end up with may still be so small that you're sort of left saying, like, shoot, do I really have enough for a chapter? Do I really have enough for a book? You know, is this something that colleagues that don't study this era or don't know the challenges of this, that they're going to respect? Is that going to give me tenure? Is that going to get me some award from the American Historical Association? And so this is, as I said, the great sort of challenge we face when we try to really take seriously researching and writing about Black women in the 19th century and using sort of archival materials in order to reconstruct their lives, okay? Now, one more point about this that I think is really important that we have to be honest about, and that is a little more uncomfortable. Now, part of the metaphysical challenge of doing research in the archives in New England and Connecticut, when I was doing work in graduate, I actually was fortunate to take a seminar with Bruce Laurie in his early days when he was working on his book, his Garrison book. So I was in this sort of anti-slavery seminar at UMass. So we were really working in the archives. And actually I was doing a project on Samuel Hill, right? So in these sort of formative moments of doing work on, say, a person like Samuel Hill, right? Who, you know, you think he's, in terms of the dotting of the landscape of Florence, is Samuel Hill, right? He's a person who is quite prominent just by the things that bear his name. The challenge as a Black person driving into Willimantic, Connecticut, you know, parking your car, some people don't think about, right? What time does the Historical Society close? Will it be dark when it closes? What does it mean to drive back from tiny, small Connecticut, Massachusetts town as a Black graduate student, right? Are you gonna get pulled over, right? When you get there. So then that's the sort of like, then you arrive. And then you have to confront the sort of all the sorts of ways in which racism and race play out in all of our experience where Black people live in Connecticut Valley. That is the assumption that, first of all, your project is not all that valuable and there's nothing there, right? You'd be surprised how many people will tell me, oh, there's nothing in the archives. So if you try to go down and try to explain to archivists, who, by the way, in their lives, they're the smartest people that anyone knows. So in their daily lives, they are the smartest person about history than anyone who they interact with. And that carries an arrogance that puts you off, right? There's a certain arrogance that you have to deal with that's metaphysical, that's hard to really explain and admit, right? When you're trying to do work around African Americans, when you're in and you're doing that sort of work I described in small archives. I mean, it's much easier to drive to New York City and park your car. You're in the village, you go to Tamanet Library. It's like you have a pass, like, you know, it's not as uncomfortable. when you're driving through small towns, knocking on the door, trying to call up people to see what the hours are for the, these small different societies and things, there's another layer that's very challenging. Going to Vermont, for example, to the State House and and sort of doing research. It's something that's hard to really articulate, but it's discouraging. And so when you think about knowledge construction, when you think about who are the people who are going to do the work to reconstruct the lives of Black women who live in Western Mass, for example, in Northern Connecticut, you also have to realize that some of the people that would be doing that work in terms of Black people or graduate students in history or Black studies also are confronting, like, how few trips can I make to Northwestern Mass to get the materials I need, just because I don't feel actually comfortable being in those spaces, right? And that's another, again, barrier and challenge we face when we attempt to really promote research and writing about Black women, particularly in this era, and particularly when we're working in places and spaces where there's just so few Black people, and we're also dealing with people who don't interact with Black people that much. And then you can imagine when you're a professor with all those. I think Tara made up a few of those awards and things. So a few things I was like, Tara, I think you're making up some stuff. Thank you, Tara. You can always be my intro person. But you can imagine what it's like. It's like you're a professor, a tenured professor, but still people treat you like you don't know anything. They treat you like you're ignorant because they've just never confronted a Black person who actually has studied and done as much research as you've done. And so you have to sort of like, all right, suck up the microaggressions, flatter them, make them feel great. And then maybe they'll do you a favor and go do the job they're supposed to be doing in the first place, right? So there's that metaphysical reality that also, in my view, has a major impact on the work, on being able to do the work in a way that's going to get us forward faster in ways that represent all this energy, right, around Black lives and Black lives in the Valley, all this sort of stuff. There's that work that is that. So what is the solution? I'll tell you a couple of solutions. Number one, and this is what I've been preaching this, I'll keep preaching it, right? Every single person that has access to archives, right? So all the small archives need to be involved in what I think about as like sort of like a massive crowdsourcing effort, right? So everyone needs to turn around, go into their archive, and just search for anything that's to do with Black women, anything. Don't say, oh, this might be valuable or that might not be valuable, but literally en masse, go out, spend the time, hire an intern, say, listen, intern, we're gonna go through every single thing we physically have, and we're gonna see if we can see, and now it's hard, right? It's hard to know identity, but we're gonna do the best we can to find anything we can that might, maybe, we don't know, signal the presence of Black women, right? If we have 100 people working at 100 places simultaneously with the sole task to find any shred of evidence of the presence of Black people in this smallest town, right? And then that material is placed in, say, a digital archive, right? We will move faster, right? We will move in a way that's encouraging, okay? Because it's like, once you know that there's a shred, then you'll drive to Northeast Massachusetts and risk getting pulled over in a car and all the psychic damage that happens when you're profiled. You're more likely to take the risk if at least you know that there could be something there, right? And so once this 100 people work in 100 places, in manuscript collections that aren't available, that sort of are private collections too, I'm talking about, right, held in families, passed down, and people at least put it online, or at least even put online what they have, right? So in other words, just like a list of like, here's what we found. We're not sure if this even stuff is per se valuable to anybody. We will at least like sort of inaugurate what I think to be like a social movement towards recovering Black lives, right? And towards recovering Black women history. Because anything and outside of that, I think it will keep at this sort of like really, really slow pace towards being able to figure out and find more to help us have a better understanding of the experience of Black women who live in the Connecticut Valley. And also, by extension, thinking about this, of course, everywhere in the United States, you know, and as a massive social movement to reconstitute the lives of 19th century and 18th century Black women. And maybe I'll close out with this comment before I let all of you sort of, you know, I'm curious what people's impressions are. I mean, just think about Mum Bet for a second, Elizabeth Freeman. Just for 1 second. All right, so you have this person who's a global figure, not an American figure, a global figure, right? At minimum is a national figure, right? Black woman, sues for freedom. And how do I know that? Go to the African American Museum. In the African American Museum, DC, there's a statue to Mum Bet, right? Elizabeth Freeman. She's a figure, and yet how much work. I actually went back to Douglas Edgerton's book, his chapter about Mum Bet, and I was sort of looking to see like sort of archival work that he did to reconstruct it. And there wasn't, you know, it's manuscript collections, not much archival work, right? Because Douglas Edgerton and anyone else wanting to write a history of Mum Bet confronts what I just said. It's like, where's the material? And this is a person who actually left the narrative and is somewhat well known, right? So even figures, obviously the effort's been done with Sharing Truth, right? Even figures who, in the case of Mum Bet, who are actually really well known as Black women who lived in Western Mass, there's really not that much about her, right? And they're talking about like building a Martin Luther King statue in Boston. I'm like, and no Mum Bet statue? You know what I mean? Like, so again, it's more than just finding the scraps of evidence. It's also prioritizing Black women and saying, we need to make it a singular priority to find every shred of evidence about the Black women, the presence of Black women in every hamlet in the Northeast, right? Unless we make that a priority and everyone works collectively to try to find these materials so historians can go use them for their projects. Again, I don't see how we're going to really progress, but I do have hope with like the Documenting Black Lives Project and other sort of initiatives that this is going to happen. And even just on a personal level, like I started this Africana Studies Research Collective, sort of fell apart with COVID, but I started a collective among students, right? So a research collective, right? Not just a club, like a research collective. We went down to the AS, you know, the American Antiquarian Society. I took these students, only like 5 students joined, you know, Black women is one brother was in it too. And we went in there and I just introduced them to what it is to do archival. Just like, come on in, let's, you know, look in some archives. Let's look at the presence of enslaved people in the 1740s in Worcester, right? So we also need these sort of initiatives where we like get people, young people particularly, to get out in archives and to see what it's like to touch a box, an old piece of paper, and they touched it and ripped it. I was like, oh my God, you ripped it. And I was like, I'm just joking, it's okay. It's, you know, it's because they're so fragile. I mean, it's like, they know that, they just have you put the stuff up. So I like to tease my students. But unless we sort of do that, again, I think that there's wonderful possibility, right, if we take these initiatives. But of course, as I said, the challenges. So 24 minutes, it says, everybody, leaves us plenty of time for comments and questions. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much, Ousmane, for your time and your talent. Just all the work that you're doing. You made me feel like I haven't been doing very much the past couple of years, but wow. So yeah, that concludes the presentation portion of our symposium. And I wanted to open it up to questions that folks might have for any of the speakers or for any of the David Ruggles members that are on the call. Tom Goldscheider or Kim Gerould or Ousmane Power-Greene. If you want to type in the chat or raise your hand, we'll be able to see that you have questions and be able to answer them in the order that they came in.
Also, anyone may unmute themselves now if they wish to ask a question.
Thank you, Nina. Voice from the beyond.
Christopher Clark has a question.
Hello, this is for Ousmane. Hello, Ousmane. Good to see you, and thanks for a great talk.
Thank you.
This is really inspiring. So, I mean, one of the issues that you were talking about is sort of the profession's resistance to this kind of thing. And I think there is a practical issue which students face. You know this, and all our graduate students know this. You have to have a project that you can get work done on promptly. And when you're an assistant professor, you have to have a project that will get you tenure. And the problem that you've been describing is partly that the material is so fragmented and so difficult to identify that it's not something you would embark on. So I think the suggestion that you're making, if it could come to fruition, would really resolve this problem for a future generation of students and academics, as well as for independent historians who are curious about these questions. I'm sorry, my dog has a lot to say.
He wants to get involved in the conversation.
Well, that's right.
Your dog, you inspire Professor Clark. I actually, you know, I remember I was, and thank you for that, your enthusiasm, because I really do think that the leadership, you know, it helps when we have senior scholars like yourself to sort of, you know, at whatever point one can sort of encourage and even sign their name to digitization projects that offer the possibility of this. But you know what made me think about, I was fortunate and blessed early on to get one of the sort of short-term research fellowships. And I remember finding some materials about the colonization movement and thinking to myself, this is like back in like 2007, like if all people who are writing about the colonization on a local level, like Boston, sort of, you know, the so smaller Hampton Colonization Society, if we all like took our little evidence and like put it together, right? Like then suddenly the international scholars and scholars all over would be able to see these like state and local, colonization societies. Because otherwise, if you win the fellowship, and that's what I'm trying to get at, then you get to go inside, you know, maybe the Athenaeum or wherever, and look at, you know, some of these, you know, smaller pamphlets of sessions of small colonization societies. But if you don't win that fellowship, then you're sort of left to wait until they digitize it, which in some cases, who knows when different organizations are gonna get the funding to be able to digitize the smaller, because my ambition is to write a really smaller history, a more narrow history, somewhat like Professor Laurie's about colonization movement in Massachusetts, you know, really like every single local one. But again, you know, this is the sort of stuff that you confront. So anyway, I just want to bring that up because I feel like this possibility, you know, is urgent when it comes to Black, you know, sort of Black women, but it's also something I think is possible for some of the, you know, topics that people have written about a lot, but just, we really do need people to upload and really share as colleagues, you know, just sort of what they find, which happens, you know, I mean, of course, on a small, in some field. But I think it'll be helpful overall. So anyway.
Thank you very much for your talk. It was great.
Thank you.
And thank you, Christopher Clark, for commenting. And also I wanted to just highlight your book right here for a minute. Luckily I had one, just in case you were on the call. Yeah. Many of the DRC, yeah, right here. Many of the DRC members, including Steve Strymer, always refers to your book as our Bible in a lot of ways. So I just wanted to say thank you for writing this. It's called The Communitarian Moment, and it's the radical challenge of the Northampton Association. And I also wanted to mention you have a Zoom coming up, is that correct?
Yes, there's a Zoom lecture on May 6th with the Ruggles Center, Historic Northampton, and Northampton Neighbors. So Sarah Lennox, who I believe is on this call, very kindly invited me. So I'm looking forward to that.
Wonderful. So I just wanted to tell everyone that they should check out your talk as well if they want to learn more on this subject. We did have a question come in the chat. Where did it go? Right here. It's for Ousmane. Do you have an article, or can you point to an article that addresses the same material, knowledge construction? Thank you for bringing all related points together, including metaphysical issues.
Huh. You know, honestly, it's funny you say that. Actually, I don't. I know we have other professors on you. So it's interesting. So what I was thinking a lot of, so first of all, let me just say that for me, a lot of the early foundational sort of thinking about this question came from, of course, Nell Painter's work on Sojourner Truth, right? Life and Symbol. She, you know, her last section, she really talks about the, you know, Aren't I a Woman speech. It's sort of this idea of knowledge construction and sort of, you know, I was rereading it this morning, sort of preparing for the talk, and I was just really thinking about, I mean, I've had that book forever, and I remember she came to Smith, you know, it was like the biggest deal because I was a grad, it was like, I think it was like, yeah, it was like I was a grad student or something. But she really talks about how hard it is, even when there's a piece of knowledge about a Black woman, that scholars are uncertain about, how hard it is to actually change people's perceptions about the knowledge that had been constructed about them. And so in some ways, I think that I can sort of look for this, but in a lot of ways, this comes from my own intellectual journey towards thinking about the challenges of the choices we make, right? So I'll give you one more example. So I came into UMass Amherst in the PhD program to write about Hubert Harrison, right? Black radical from Harlem. I was, intrigued by him, and I wanted to write it. One of my mentors, I don't know, Ernie Allen, he tells me soon after I arrived in the PhD program that Jeff Perry, the historian, has physically all of his papers. Like, he literally has all of Hubert Harrison's papers in his house, right? Because Hubert Harrison's children gave, Professor, Jeff Perry all of the physical papers, right? And because he was working on his dissertation at Columbia in like the 80s. Now this is like 2000, right? Eventually, those papers were sold to Columbia, and so Columbia has them available, and they're there, right? But this is sort of what happens when you look at figures who are either radical, seen as sort of radical, or figures who, in this case where it's like the people we confront in, say, a secondary source, there's not a lot on them, right? So we have the private collection issue too, but even as important, I think actually more importantly, is the value question and how we think about knowledge construction and what is valuable to construct knowledge. And that's the piece I think we can do something about, as opposed to people holding papers. And we can do something about valuing the idea of constructing knowledge around Black women in 19th century. Like, we can do something about that simply, by beginning to show that we value it, and then by searching it out and not just trying to search for people like the most popular people or most well-known. That was a long-winded answer, but it's my profession as a professor to talk and answer long-windedly. Sorry.
Thank you. That was amazing. Thank you to Sarah Crone for asking that question. I really appreciate it. Edith Daly had her hand raised. Edith, still have your question?
Yes. So mine is also for Ousmane, and that is, how do people who have a project find the students to go deeper into that project? And first, I also wanted to thank you so much for your honesty and sharing with us the microaggressions.
Okay. I actually agree. So there's a critique in there, which I agree with, which is that we need to encourage our students to take on these projects, right? So students, they only sort of know what they learn in your class. Like in that sense, like part of our role is to direct our students towards potential projects, right? And so part of what we have to do, and I'm going to give you a good example. Thank you. This is a great question. So I have a student who's doing a honors thesis on Black women and the construction historical knowledge in the 70s, Black women profession. And she also is interested in Nozaki Shange's play For Colored Girls, right? And writing about Black women, the construction of history, how that becomes a part of art. She has a chapter about Audre Lorde and sort of her efforts, right? Now, her project, right, a sort of a cultural history of that play is a very, very hard project, right? It's a very challenging project. And overall, the project of writing about the construction of Black women's history, because Deborah Gray White, I don't think she's retired yet, in the 70s, it's a very sort of challenging topic, bringing this stuff together. So we as professors have to take on projects where we know that it's going to be very challenging. It's not going to be that many materials available. And the final, like, so she just defended her thesis. There's a undergraduate honors thesis. She, like, it's not going to be as like sound and solid as other ones, but we have to, if we don't encourage them to go out and do this work and say, you know, we're still going to accept your thesis. And even if you don't find that much, COVID hit too, which made going to New York City and all that so challenging. So it's on us, I think, as museum professionals, as historians, as public historians. Some of us are public historians, not academic historians. We have to like take on and encourage it, and maybe reach out. I guess what the last thing I would say is, you know, I would love to see like a history workshop, for example, with high school students, where we talk about this, and then even younger, middle school, where like they begin the process of researching at a young age, right? Where they go into the archives and do that. So by the time they get to high school or college, going in archives, looking for Black women, for example, is not like something that's like a part of like an honors thesis your senior year. It's a part of what you see as a valuable person understanding the world. And so I think that, so I agree with what I see to be an applied critique, which is how do you get students, where do you find the students? I agree, and I think that it needs to happen also a part of this like grassroots history movement towards study, right? So maybe we do a work, we have a conference coming up, time to do a drop, Power of Truths Conference, Bomback, June 11th. That's a good example, a workshop session on researching history of Black women, right? Inviting young people and they, wow, I hadn't thought about that, and they become interested. So we need to find vehicles and venues we can do this. And that's exactly what happened to me. I went to a conference, 19th Centuryist conference in Philly, and the archivist at the library company put on a master seminar called, title after this, Say Your Name in the Archive. So in 2017, at that conference, I sat with other Black women and me, basically, and I sat and I learned, we all wrote position papers, and I sat and learned from them about the challenges they face doing research on Black women, right? So we can replicate that at June 11th at our conference. We should replicate that at other events so people have a chance to talk about construction of knowledge, talk about the challenges and suggestions, tips. And I see that as like a social movement approach versus like a curricular approach. You know what I mean? It's like a part of like your 7th grade curriculum or something like that, or your high school social studies curriculum. That's fine also, but I have a feeling that our social studies teachers have topics they think are more important to put in the curriculum to do than Black women in Western Mass or whatever. And that's the challenge we face with relying on formal education and formal schooling.
So is there any kind of a clearinghouse for that kind of thing?
I don't know of one, but I really, I talked to those who are part of this project, documenting Black lives. I mentioned it, so hopefully we will, initiate that. I'm really hoping that that becomes a part of it. So.
Thank you. Thank you so much for asking your question. There's another question in the chat from Janice Abbott. you have a non-academic question for Ousmane. Do you still have your question?
Yes.
Hi.
Hi, thank you for your spirit in addition to everything else. But I'm looking at what you said about people who don't interact with Black people and how they have trouble having their perceptions changed because they don't know how to respond.
Yep.
And how can we, without putting people of color on the spot for educating white people,
Mhm.
how can we change that?
Yeah. So first of all, thanks for coming. It's great to see you.
Great to see you too.
No, so I wrote the essay actually intentionally for that reason. So I think for a starting point is that for Black people to say like actually what they think and not and like not being afraid to offend white people. I think that's part of the challenge is like, you know, you don't really want to say that. And then what happens is people say, oh, well, he's like that to everybody, or like, yeah, I know, but it's a problem because it stops young Black PhD students from going to his archive. So how do you do it? I think, you know, I'm optimistic, and I think that people oftentimes don't realize it. So I'm going to go with the educator, like people do need to sort of be educated and they need to think critically. So it's a process of reflection that, you know, the work that you've done in your career in life. I mean, people, every single person who works, you know, who lives in, you know, a, not only to say predominantly white, I'm saying all white town with like 2 Black, every person in New England needs to like stop and really reflect and think like what are like the behaviors, the jokes, like what are the things I do that maybe honestly people might find offensive? Like there has to be a process of introspection. And then I think that, you know, that more broadly, instead of like a sort of diversity training that's broad, I think that every organization could just sit down and say like, all right, so Ousmane wrote this essay and he brought up all these points. Like, wow, that really made me think. Like, what do we think about, you know, this sort of challenge and come up with answers that really fit, you know, the circumstances of the place. Because so I agree. It's like, you know, I would never want to put like my, you know, this Black woman to do this project. Like, I don't want to put, you know, send her out there and let her be the experiment. You know what I mean? Like, and so I think that you know, that people need to really reflect on the ways in which racism has shaped the way they think about Black people. And oftentimes people just don't, they think it's about like something beyond what I'm talking about. You know, so it's like being, you know, being like super nice to me. It's like, you don't need to be super nice to me. Like there's just so many things that just, if people would just do a little reflection as a starting point, I think that would help. And then there are structural barriers. Like, I mean, do you think, I don't think a lot of you know, sort of think like what it's like to drive at nighttime, for example. Like people just don't think about stuff like parking, for example. I've been to places where it's like, I don't know, it's like, it says no parking on the street. Like, I don't know where to park. See what I'm saying? So like, and they don't think like, oh, well, you know, if someone who's not from around here is, you know, they may be concerned, right, about their car. And so if we just all do like a sort of introspection and assume that you know, sort of like not think through how sensitive every person's going to be. Everyone's different. Every Black person's different. But just like there's a few things that we could just knock out that would just, and I also think going out in communities too. I think that, you know, if I'm an archivist, and again, it's a hard job, you know, people are by the way, people are volunteers also. It's like, they can only do Saturdays till 9 at night. Like, it's just, there are structural aspects that need to be thought through. But I do think that we can get out into schools, into communities, we can go to Harvard, other places and provide opportunities. And if you provide opportunities, I think that would help dramatically. We can't solve everything, but I think that like 3 things: go into communities if you have an archive and talk about a project you're trying to do. Encourage school groups, encourage teachers to be involved. That's 1. 2, think about parking and darkness and what it'd be like to be a vulnerable person, right? And then 3, when people come in the archive, don't act like you're doing them a favor, because you're not. You know what I mean? Like, just help them, you know, don't make assumptions, help them no matter how valuable you think it is or isn't, you know, just help and don't be annoying, basically. Be a nice person and don't be like, you know, but I think that that's part of it, is that it's something that people just haven't been checked on, and so they don't even think about it. But the impact is great when it comes to inviting people to our community. And I feel the same way about the Power Truth Conference. It's like, I'm gonna invite people from Springfield to come to Florence, everybody. Now suddenly we just increased the quantity of people who are Black in Florence by like 700%. Like, what impact is that gonna have on Florence? I think I bring that up. Like, I say that to people because it is a reality for trying to do conferences in spaces that are small. Again, another wonderfully long, somewhat rambling answer. But like I said, it's my profession.
It's good.
I'll blame that.
It's helpful.
Yeah, I mean, I found it helpful too, just thinking about the things that you don't think about, you know, if you don't know or you don't have that lived experience, you know, and a lot of it is that lived experience and having that stop where you stop to actually think about other people's perspectives and lives and what ifs and stuff. And lots of people don't have time to go down that road or think in that way. So thank you for placemaking that. And I also just wanted to say before I call on Tess, because I know you've had your hand raised for a little while, you know, Ousmane, if you want to put a link to the Power of Truth conference in the chat so people can see it, or Christopher, if you wanted to put your info about your talk too, just so people have it handy. I know it's so crazy these days. People don't have time, they forget, it slips through the cracks. And so without further ado, Tess, Gerould, do you still have your question?
Okay, it's Frank. I'm on Tess's computer, so.
Oh, okay, sorry, Frank.
Yeah, that's okay. That's good. I'm asking a question of my sister, Kim. I wanted to know if there was any religious dimension to the Northampton Association. I know a lot of utopian communities in the 19th century were religious, and that's what held them together. And I was wondering if the Northampton Association was essentially secular, or if it was a religious commitment that made it stick together.
I'm going to defer to Tom and Kim.
So I'll respond to that. And if Chris Clark wants to add anything, it was non-denominational. It did not have a religious focus. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, no, that's good.
Okay. And a lot of members actually had been religious, but they left their churches. They were called come-outers because they were fed up with their church's lukewarm take on abolition. They were more radical. So a lot of them had left their churches. It doesn't mean they weren't religious, but there was no one denomination. They had Sunday meetings outside under this pine grove in Florence, which I think you visited. And they were open meetings, people could speak about anything. So there wasn't that religious dimension. And there wasn't a charismatic leader either, and where there was to some degree in other so-called utopian communities. And it was pretty democratic. By the second year, they had voted to have one person, one vote, whether you were a investor in the community or not. So it was pretty egalitarian. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Frank, I love that you're here supporting your sister. Where are you? Are you in the area? Yeah.
I live in Philadelphia, so I always enjoy visiting Northampton. It's a beautiful community, and this history is really special. So Philadelphia, of course, has the Radical Library.
Oops, you got frozen.
Yeah, I think Frank's frozen, but I think that's great, Kim. I'm, and for me, a lot of the conversations that I've been having with people lately.
And then the Quakers and the Quaker history too.
Sorry, Frank, you froze. So I don't know if you want to go back a minute in time and repeat what you were saying about the Radical Library in Philadelphia.
Well, there's something called the Library Company in Philadelphia where I guess Ousmane has worked there, and historians from all over the country come there to do work on abolitionism and the revolutionary period, and then there's all the Quaker abolitionists here, you know, Lucretia Mott and Benezet, and you know, there was a lot of early history here.
That's great. And I think you missed because you had froze, but I was just saying that you supporting your sister and having a community, you know, I think that in times that we're in right now, you know, a lot of people feel powerless to do this or that, or make moves or make waves or make a difference. And, you know, this to me right here, just the power of family, the power of connection, inviting the people that you know to have a conversation, to have a Zoom meeting, to have a walking tour or whatever. I think that we can all make inroads and small steps to being more connected, learning more from each other, and sort of making the future different rather than our behaviors from pre-COVID or how we used to be. So thanks for being.
I just want to say one thing, that he's responsible for me becoming a radical. He mentored me early on when he was an SDSer, and he got me into it. So we've mentored each other, I guess, right?
I love it. Thanks, Frank. Does anyone else have any other questions? I see that Chris just put his link for his May 6th talk in the chat. That's also on Zoom, so it's really and I use the word easy in air quotes, but easier to get to than in person. And then I know Ousmane was gonna put something in there maybe.
I'm not sure if the landing is up yet. I was just,
okay.
I saw it, but I don't think it's up, but.
So will that landing page be on Bombeck's?
Yeah, it'll be on Bombeck's. We'll put it on Ruggles Center 1, and we'll email people if there's an email list around for registration. So.
Great. And I also just wanted to make a plug for Bombeck's Center in Florence. They've been doing some really phenomenal programming, and Ousmane mentioning increasing the African-American population of Florence by 700%. I know that they're doing a lot of work to bring in internationally renowned BIPOC performers that you don't see a lot of other places. So please do try to support Cassandra and Kyle, who are doing really wonderful work in Florence and regionally with other programmings that they bring through Barbets in the Woods and Montague and Mill Pond in East Hampton. Laudable Productions is the name of their parent company. So thank you for thinking about supporting them as well. All right. If no one else has any other questions, I just wanted to say thank you so much to everyone for joining. The David Ruggles Center really appreciates it. And oh, Sarah,
I just want to say thank you for the program. I enjoyed it. And, you know, I'm really proud of Kim and all the work that she's doing.
That's great. So yes, thank you. Thank you, everyone. You can find more information about us if you need to at davidrugglescenter.org. Are you waving, Sarah? Yes.
Waving my hand, yes.
Oh,
I
yeah.
have a question that I posted in the chat. Do you want to read it, Tara?
Sure. Let's see. Okay. This one's for Ousmane. I am really excited by the idea of people going into archives and finding every shred of evidence about Black people and women. So what is the next step? Is anyone concretely promoting that? Or if not, what's the next step? Could that come out of the June 11th conference?
Yeah. So I, as Sarah knows, I give a lot of suggestions to people to do a lot of things. But this is one that was a part of, so there's a steering committee that is a part of the Documenting Black Lives series. So we've only had one meeting so far, Sarah, and everyone else who's here. And so this is the sort of initiative that would be, to me, central. And the essay that I finished that they posted includes sort of this call to everyone. And so it's sort of underneath the broader initiative. So the answer is not really, besides me saying it right this second, but as I said at the Power of Truth conference, this is something that as I have been emailing individuals to participate, and people who are on here, please, my email is Power-Greene@ClarkU.edu. But if people are interested in this initiative, or this event, June 11th is that's much of what we're trying to do, is to have a conference that brings artists and educators, academics, teachers together in order to create these initiatives and really get momentum, learn from other places, like in Maryland, for example, with some reasons, and just learn from other places. So the ambitions are absolutely to use that as a jump off. But there hasn't been a session yet. I don't think anyone said yes to something like this yet, but hopefully there will be. And I'll be, offering this to more people to take up as a topic, really real, sort of like to initiate, like I said, a social movements approach.
Great. Great.
All right. Anybody else? Going once, going twice. Okay. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us. Happy Sunday. We look forward to you in person. Yeah, no problem. Look forward to seeing you.
Great job.
Thank you.